The unlikely hero. It was an ordinary afternoon, one that started like any other. Jamal, a 12-year-old boy, walked home from school, his backpack slung over his shoulder. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and everything seemed peaceful. But Jamal didn't know that in just a few moments, he would be forced to make a life-or-death decision that would change everything. Jamal wasn't a hero. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest boy in school. In fact, he preferred staying quiet and keeping to himself. He often found comfort in reading books or drawing pictures of far-off places, imagining himself as a brave adventurer or a daring knight. But those were just dreams. In real life, Jamal didn't see himself as someone who would ever do something heroic. But that all changed when he turned the corner onto the street that led home. As he walked, Jamal noticed something strange. Ahead of him, just past the tall trees lining the sidewalk, a small figure was struggling. A little girl, no older than 6, was being pulled by a man into the woods. Her feet dragged against the dirt path, and she was kicking and screaming for help. Jamal stopped dead in his tracks. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at the scene. The girl's face was twisted in fear, her tiny hands reaching out, trying to break free. The man was much bigger than her, and his grip on her was tight, like he was determined to take her no matter what. Jamal's mind raced. He knew he couldn't just stand there and watch. The world around him seemed to slow down. The birds stopped singing. The only thing he could hear was the girl's desperate cries for help. He looked around, but there was no one else in sight. No one to stop this man. No one to help the little girl. For a moment, Jamal froze. What could he do? He was just a kid. The man was an adult, and Jamal didn't have the strength to fight him. But then something inside him clicked. It was a feeling he couldn't ignore, a feeling that told him he had to act. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't let this happen. Without thinking, Jamal took a deep breath and started running toward the woods. His legs felt heavy, like they didn't want to move, but he kept going. His body seemed to have a mind of its own. He had to reach that little girl before it was too late. As Jamal got closer, the man turned around, his eyes narrowing as he saw Jamal approaching. The girl continued to scream, her voice trembling with fear. Jamal's stomach twisted with worry, but he pushed forward, running as fast as he could. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew that if he didn't act, the girl would be lost. "Let her go," Jamal shouted as he reached the man. His voice was shaky, but he stood tall, determined to protect the little girl. The man paused for a moment, surprised by the boy's boldness, but he didn't let go of the girl. Instead, he sneered, annoyed by the interruption. Jamal didn't back down. He knew that if he didn't make the man release the girl, she would be gone, and there would be no one to stop him. So Jamal pushed the man with all his strength, trying to break his grip on the girl. "Stop," the man growled. "You don't know what you're doing." But Jamal didn't listen. He was scared, but his fear was drowned out by the need to save the girl. In that moment, everything else faded away. There was only the girl, the man, and Jamal. Nothing else mattered. With one last push, Jamal managed to knock the man off balance. The man stumbled back, shocked by Jamal's strength. The girl, still terrified, stumbled away from the man's grip and ran toward Jamal. He grabbed her hand and pulled her behind him, trying to shield her from the man. But the man wasn't finished yet. He lunged forward, reaching for the girl again, but Jamal stood in his way. He didn't know how he was going to stop him, but he wasn't going to let the man take her. He couldn't. "Leave her alone," Jamal shouted again, his voice louder this time. His heart raced in his chest, but he refused to back down. For a moment, there was silence. The man glared at Jamal, his face filled with anger. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of attacking, the man backed off, his eyes shifting nervously around. It was as if he realized that Jamal wasn't going to be intimidated. Without another word, The man turned and fled into the woods, disappearing from sight. Jamal stood there, breathless, holding the girl's hand tightly in his own. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had saved her. The little girl looked up at Jamal, her eyes wide with awe and gratitude. She didn't say anything, but her expression spoke volumes. Jamal smiled, relieved that the danger was over, but also in shock. He had done it. He had acted without thinking, without hesitation, and it had worked. Jamal had saved her. In that moment, Jamal realized something about himself. He wasn't just a quiet, shy boy anymore. He was a hero. And this would be a day he would never forget. The unexpected rescue. Jamal's heart was still pounding in his chest as he stood there in the woods, holding the little girl's hand. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He had never imagined that a regular afternoon walk home from school would turn into something so intense, so life-changing. The adrenaline still buzzed in his body, making his legs feel shaky. The girl, no older than 6, was crying softly, her little face pale with fear. Her eyes, wide and filled with relief, met Jamal's. She was trembling, her hands still shaking, but she clung to Jamal as if he were her lifeline. He gently squeezed her hand, trying to comfort her, even though he himself was still in shock. "Are you okay?" Jamal asked, his voice soft but full of concern. He didn't know if the girl could hear him over her sobs, but he wanted to make sure she felt safe now. The girl nodded, sniffling as she wiped her tears away with the back of her sleeve. "Thank you. Thank you for saving me," she whispered, barely able to speak through her tears. Jamal didn't know what to say. He had never been in a situation like this before. He wasn't used to being the hero. But standing there, with the girl clinging to him, Jamal realized how important his decision to step in had been. He hadn't hesitated when he saw her in trouble. He had acted. He looked down at the girl, still holding her hand. "What's your name?" Jamal asked, trying to take her mind off the fear. "Maya," she said softly, her voice still shaky. "I was walking home from the park. Then he grabbed me," she added, her voice trailing off as she remembered the scary moment. Jamal's heart tightened in his chest. He couldn't believe what he had just stopped. That man had been taking Maya, and if Jamal hadn't intervened, who knew what could have happened? Jamal looked around the woods, half expecting the man to return. The whole situation felt surreal, but there was no sign of him. The woods were silent, except for the sound of Maya's soft sobs and Jamal's uneven breaths. He could see the path where they had just run, and the reality of the moment began to settle in. "Don't worry. He's gone," Jamal said reassuringly, though he wasn't entirely sure. He wanted to believe it was true. He wanted to believe that he had kept Maya safe for good. But as much as Jamal tried to reassure her, something inside him told him they weren't out of danger just yet. He needed to get Maya out of the woods, back to safety, and away from that man, in case he came back. "Let's get out of here," Jamal said, gently tugging on her hand. "I'll walk you home." Maya nodded, grateful for his presence. She wiped her face one last time, and they began walking down the path, slowly at first, until Jamal started walking faster, urging Maya to keep up. He looked over his shoulder every few seconds, just to be sure they weren't being followed. As they reached the edge of the woods and stepped onto the road, Jamal took a deep breath, feeling a little more at ease. They were no longer in the thick of the trees, where danger could hide behind every shadow. The town's familiar buildings were now in sight, and Jamal felt a little safer. Maya seemed to relax a bit too, though she still clung to Jamal's side. The closer they got to the busy street, the less it seemed like the nightmare from earlier had actually happened. Jamal's thoughts were still a blur, but he couldn't help but feel proud of himself. He had saved her. A simple action, a decision to run toward danger instead of away from it, had made all the difference. Jamal and Maya continued walking down the road, passing familiar shops and houses. It was strange, though. Nothing around them had changed. The world still looked the same as it always did. People were walking by, cars were dragging past, and life was going on as if nothing had happened. But Jamal knew that everything had changed for him in that moment. He had done something brave, something he never thought he would do. And in that moment, Jamal realized he wasn't just a boy anymore. He was someone who had the courage to stand up and do what was right. As they approached the end of the block, Maya stopped walking and looked up at Jamal, her big brown eyes filled with gratitude. "You're my hero," she said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. Jamal blushed, unsure of how to respond. Hero. He was just a kid, like her. But for some reason, hearing Maya call him that made him feel proud, even though he felt like he had just done what anyone else would do. "Don't worry about it," Jamal said, trying to brush it off. "I just did what anyone should have done." But deep down, Jamal knew he wasn't just anyone. He was someone who had taken action when it mattered most. He had been the one to step in and stop something horrible from happening. The two of them reached the street corner, where Maya's house was just a few houses down. Maya turned to Jamal and gave him a tight hug, still trembling but visibly calmer now. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." Jamal smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "You're welcome, Maya. Just stay safe, okay?" Maya nodded before turning to run toward her house. Jamal watched her for a moment, then turned and walked back home, his heart still racing, but now with a sense of pride. He had done something that mattered. The shocking consequences. Jamal couldn't believe what had just happened. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but now it was replaced by a lingering unease. The sight of Maya running into her house had been comforting, but it didn't ease the tension that had gripped him since the moment he saw her being dragged into the woods. He kept replaying the event in his mind, over and over again. What if he hadn't acted fast enough? What if that man had hurt her before he arrived? The what-ifs clouded his thoughts as he walked home, his pace quicker than usual. He was trying to shake the feeling of anxiety, but it wouldn't leave him. As Jamal neared his block, he saw his mother standing on the porch, her face filled with concern. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and she looked like she had been waiting for him for a while. "Jamal, where have you been?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You're late, and I've been calling you. Are you okay?" Jamal paused, unsure of what to say. He couldn't tell her about the terrifying moment in the woods. She would never let him out again if she knew what had happened. "I'm fine, Mom," Jamal said quickly, trying to hide the unease in his voice. "I just lost track of time." His mother looked him over, clearly unconvinced. But before she could ask more questions, Jamal quickly added, "I just helped someone, Mom. It took longer than I thought." His mother's brow furrowed, but she didn't press him further. Instead, she sighed and shook her head. "I don't know what I would do if something happened to you. You need to be more careful, Jamal." Jamal nodded, his stomach churning. He had no intention of telling her what had actually happened. He didn't want to worry her, and he definitely didn't want to admit that he had been involved in something so dangerous. "Okay, Mom," he said softly. "I will." But as Jamal entered the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. The incident in the woods wasn't over, not by a long shot. Something bigger was brewing. The next morning, as Jamal was finishing his breakfast, the doorbell rang. He glanced at his mother, who was already up and moving toward the door. "Jamal, can you get that?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. "Sure," Jamal replied, standing up from the table and walking toward the door. He opened it, expecting to see one of his friends, or maybe a neighbor, but when he saw who was standing there, his heart skipped a beat. It was a police officer. "Good morning," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "Is this the residence of Jamal Williams?" Jamal froze. His mind raced. What could this be about? Did the man from the woods file a report? Was he in trouble for intervening? "Yes, that's me," Jamal answered cautiously, trying to remain calm. The officer nodded. We received a report about an incident yesterday. Are you the young man who assisted a little girl in the woods? Jamal's breath caught in his throat. How did they know? He hadn't said anything to anyone about what happened. That's right, Jamal said quietly, his palms suddenly sweating. I helped her. The officer gave him a sympathetic look, then pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. We just need to ask you a few questions about what happened. Do you mind? Jamal swallowed hard. His stomach turned as the officer asked him to sit down on the porch and recount everything that had happened. He explained the events, leaving out as many details as he could, not wanting to mention the part where he had nearly been the one to fight off the stranger. His mother, who had come to the door when she heard the officer's voice, stood behind him with an anxious expression on her face. She was watching Jamal closely, as if sensing something wasn't quite right. Jamal, what's going on? She asked, concern clear in her tone. Jamal glanced up at her, but before he could answer, the officer spoke. We're just trying to piece together what happened, Mom, he said, looking at Jamal's mother. It's important that we get as many details as possible. Jamal's mind raced as he tried to remember everything about the woods. The way the man had grabbed Maya, the way he had struggled against him. But nothing seemed to make sense anymore. He had been so sure that he was helping, but now it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. After what felt like hours, the officer finally stood up. Thank you for your time, young man. We may need to speak to you again, but for now, we'll leave it at that. Jamal nodded, but his heart was heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The officer's visit felt like the calm before the storm. There was more to the story, and Jamal wasn't sure if he was ready for it. As the officer left, Jamal stood at the door, his mind swirling. Why had the police suddenly shown up? What did they know? And why was it that, despite saving a life, Jamal felt like he was walking on a razor's edge? His mother, still standing behind him, placed a hand on his shoulder. Are you sure you're okay? She asked softly. Jamal didn't have an answer. He just knew that the past 24 hours had changed everything. He had saved a life. But it seemed like that act of bravery had opened the door to something much bigger than he ever expected. Unraveling the truth, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The visit from the police officer had left him more confused than ever. He had done the right thing by saving Maya, but now he was caught in something that he didn't fully understand. What had happened in those woods? Who was that man? And why was he after a little girl? The following day, Jamal sat in his room, trying to focus on his homework, but his mind kept wandering back to the events of the past few days. The way the officer had looked at him, the questions he asked, they didn't seem to add up. He had only tried to help Maya, so why did he feel like he was being treated like a suspect? He couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that something bigger was at play. Jamal's phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. He grabbed it quickly, hoping it was one of his friends to distract him from the growing tension. But when he saw the name on the screen, his stomach dropped. It was Maya's mom. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should answer. After all, he had barely spoken to Maya's family since the incident. What would they want? But he knew he couldn't ignore it. He had to find out what was really going on. Taking a deep breath, Jamal swiped the screen and put the phone to his ear. "Hello," he said, his voice shaky. "Jamal, it's Mrs. Johnson, Maya's mom," the voice on the other end said. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything, but I wanted to talk to you." Jamal's heart raced. "Of course, Mrs. Johnson. What's up?" There was a pause on the other end before she continued. "Jamal, I need to apologize. After everything that happened yesterday, I didn't realize how serious it was. I didn't realize what was really going on with that man. I thought he was just a random stranger, but now I'm not so sure." Jamal's mind spun. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Mrs. Johnson's voice lowered. "I've been doing some digging. I spoke with a few neighbors who saw something strange about that man. He wasn't just some random guy. He's been in the area before. In fact, he's been spotted near the woods several times, and it's always when a young girl is nearby. Jamal, I think this man has been following Maya. Jamal's heart sank. He hadn't realized the situation was this serious. All he had known was that Maya had been in trouble, and he had helped her. But now it sounded like the danger had been there for a long time, and he had no idea how deep it went. I'm so sorry, Jamal. I had no idea. I should have taken better care of Maya, Mrs. Johnson said, her voice filled with guilt. But I'm telling you this because I need you to be careful. That man, whoever he is, he's not just going to let this go. He's dangerous, and now he knows who you are. Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. He had saved Maya, but now he was in the man's sights. He had no idea what this person was capable of, but the thought of being followed by someone dangerous made his stomach turn. The threat gets closer. The days after Jamal's conversation with Mrs. Johnson felt heavier than ever. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. The quiet moments at school felt unnerving, as if every shadow held a secret. Every passing glance was more than it seemed. Even the most mundane parts of his day, like walking home or sitting in class, felt charged with a new kind of tension. Every time he walked past a window or looked down the street, he found himself scanning the area, looking for any sign of that man. But no one stood out. No one looked out of place, or at least that's what he hoped. Jamal tried to focus on his schoolwork, but it was nearly impossible. His thoughts kept drifting back to the woods, to Maya, and to that man. He couldn't forget the look in Maya's eyes when she was pulled away. The fear, the panic. He had to protect her. But how? That afternoon, Jamal walked home from school, taking his usual route. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the street. It was a peaceful neighborhood, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him. The sound of footsteps, soft but steady. Jamal's heart raced. He turned around quickly, expecting to see a friend or a neighbor. But no one was there. The street was empty, just like it had been when he started his walk. He tried to shake it off and kept walking, but his pulse wouldn't slow down. Then, just as he turned a corner, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A car was parked by the side of the road, its engine running. The windows were tinted, so Jamal couldn't see who was inside. But something about it felt wrong. The car wasn't there when he had passed by earlier, and now it seemed to be waiting, watching. Jamal's instincts screamed at him to turn around and walk the other way, but something held him in place. He couldn't ignore it. Not now. He stepped closer to the car, trying to see if anyone was inside. His eyes scanned the tinted windows, but he couldn't make out anything. Then, the driver's side window rolled down slowly. Jamal froze. He expected to see a stranger, someone he didn't know. Instead, the face that appeared made his heart skip a beat. It was the same man who had been lurking in the woods that day. The same man who had been watching Maya. The man's eyes locked with Jamal's, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Jamal couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The man's face was cold, expressionless. He didn't smile, didn't say a word. He simply stared. Jamal's stomach churned. What did he want? Why was he here? The man didn't speak, but the tension in the air was thick, like a storm about to break. Jamal took a step back, his hands shaking. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced. He knew he should run, but he couldn't make his legs move. The man was too close, too still. And then, just as quickly as the man had appeared, the window rolled back up. The car's engine roared to life, and the man drove off, disappearing down the street. Jamal stood there, frozen for a few moments, unable to move or think clearly. What had just happened? Why had the man appeared now, and why had he made no move to engage Jamal? The encounter left Jamal with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. The danger wasn't just in the woods. It was here, right in his own neighborhood. With his heart still racing, Jamal finally managed to pull himself together. He needed to get home, to think. But as he turned around and hurried back toward his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't done with him yet. The incident had only confirmed what Jamal had feared. The threat was real, and it was getting closer. He had no idea what the man wanted, but Jamal knew he had to stay alert. He couldn't let his guard down. Not for a second. As Jamal reached his house, he looked over his shoulder one last time. He didn't see the car, but that didn't ease his nerves. The danger was still out there, and it wasn't going to go away. The question now was, what would Jamal do next? Would he confront the man? Would he tell someone what happened? Or would he wait, hoping the danger would pass? But deep down, Jamal knew the answer. The danger wasn't going away. And if he was going to protect Maya and himself, he had to take action. But what kind of action? And how far was this man willing to go? The answers were out there, waiting. But the real question was whether Jamal was ready to face them. The danger unfolds. The night was unusually quiet, and Jamal couldn't shake the events of the day from his mind. After his close encounter with the man in the car, he felt a growing sense of dread. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this afraid, this vulnerable. It wasn't just about the man anymore. It was about Maya's safety, his own safety, and the dark unknown that was closing in on them both. As Jamal lay in bed that night, he tossed and turned, unable to find peace. The image of the man's cold eyes haunted him. The way the car had appeared out of nowhere, like it had been waiting for him. Jamal couldn't help but wonder if the man knew something he didn't, if he was keeping an eye on him for a reason. Why had he been watching Maya? What did he want from Jamal? His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of his phone. He jolted up, his heart skipping a beat. Who could be calling at this hour? He checked the screen and saw it was Mrs. Johnson, the woman who had helped him after Maya was almost taken in the woods. With shaky hands, he answered the call. "Hello?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Jamal, it's Mrs. Johnson," she said, her voice tense. "You need to listen to me. You're in danger." Jamal's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Mrs. Johnson paused, and Jamal could hear the sound of heavy breathing on the other end. "That man you saw in the woods, he's not just some random stranger. He's been following you. And I think he's watching your house right now." Jamal's mind raced. "What? Are you sure?" "I'm positive," she replied. "I've been keeping an eye on things, and I've seen him near your block several times. I think he's waiting for the right moment to make his move." Jamal's pulse quickened. This was worse than he had imagined. He felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The danger was real, and it was closer than ever. "I don't know what he wants, but I know he's dangerous," Mrs. Johnson continued. "You need to be careful. Stay inside. Don't go anywhere alone. And if you see him, call the police immediately." "I will," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. I'll be careful." The call ended, and Jamal sat there in silence, his mind racing. He looked around his room, the darkness of the night now seeming oppressive, like it was closing in on him. What was he supposed to do? How could he protect Maya and himself from a man he didn't even understand? Jamal felt a sense of helplessness wash over him. The man wasn't just following them. He was playing some kind of game. And Jamal didn't know the rules. Suddenly, the quiet of the night was broken by a loud knock at the door. Jamal's heart leaped into his throat. His first instinct was to hide, to retreat into the safety of his room. But then he remembered Mrs. Johnson's warning. He had to face whatever was out there. With trembling hands, Jamal stood up and walked cautiously to the door. He peered through the peephole, but all he could see was the darkness outside. His heart was pounding, and the weight of fear made his legs feel like they were made of stone. Should he open the door? Should he call for help? Another knock, louder this time, shook him from his thoughts. Taking a deep breath, Jamal opened the door a crack, just enough to see who was on the other side. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the man standing there. The same cold eyes, the same unsettling presence, but this time, the man wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman, a tall, imposing figure with dark sunglasses, despite it being late at night. She had an air of authority about her, and Jamal's instincts told him she wasn't someone to be taken lightly. "Jamal," the man said, his voice cold and steady. "We need to talk." Jamal's throat went dry, and he stepped back instinctively, trying to close the door. But the man's hand shot out, stopping him. "No need to be scared," the man said with a smirk. "We just want to have a little conversation." Jamal's mind raced. What was this about? Why had they come to his house? What did they want from him? Before he could respond, the woman stepped forward, her expression unreadable. She tilted her head slightly and studied Jamal for a long moment. Then, without warning, she pulled out a small folded piece of paper and handed it to him. "This is for you," she said. Jamal took the paper with shaking hands. He glanced at it quickly before the woman's cold stare sent him into a panic. The paper was folded neatly, the edges sharp and precise. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single message. "You're in this now. Don't try to run." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. The word sent a chill down his spine. He had no idea what it meant, but he knew one thing for certain. The danger was far from over. The woman and the man turned to leave, but before they did, the man's voice lingered in the air. "You're not as safe as you think." Jamal slammed the door shut behind them, his heart racing. What was going on? Who were these people? And what did they mean by "you're in this now"? As he stood there in the quiet darkness, Jamal knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The unraveling mystery. Jamal stood frozen in his doorway, the chilling message in his hand. "You're in this now. Don't try to run." The words burned in his mind like a warning, a reminder that the danger was real, and it was following him. His heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. What did they want from him? Why was he being targeted? And what was the truth behind the cryptic note they left behind? The heavy silence in the house was unbearable. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, lurking in the shadows. He quickly scanned his surroundings, peering through every window, checking every corner of the house. He couldn't risk being caught off guard again. His first instinct was to call for help, to get the authorities involved, but something told him that would only make things worse. These people didn't seem like ordinary criminals. They were methodical, cold, and they knew more than they should. Jamal's mind flashed to the earlier encounter, the one with the man in the car. Had they been watching him all along? Was it possible they knew his every move? He couldn't help but wonder if his life had been under surveillance long before tonight. With his heart still racing, Jamal took the note and tucked it into his pocket. He had to get out of the house, to find a way to figure this out. He needed answers, but where could he go? Who could he trust? Suddenly, there was a soft tap on the window. Jamal froze, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't alone. Someone was outside. He dared not move, afraid that any sudden movement would make him a target. Another tap, this time louder. Jamal slowly turned toward the window, his heart in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He had to see who it was. With slow, cautious movements, he approached the window. The curtains were drawn, but he could just make out a shadow moving on the other side. His fingers shook as he slowly pulled the curtain back just a few inches. It was Maya. Jamal's breath rushed out of him in relief. He opened the window a little, enough to hear her voice. "Jamal." "I saw them," Maya whispered urgently. "They're watching you. They know everything." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. "Who's watching me, Maya?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Maya glanced nervously over her shoulder before leaning closer. The same people. The ones who've been following you. I heard them talking. They want you to do something. Something bad. Jamal's eyes widened. What do you mean? What do they want me to do? Maya hesitated. I don't know, Jamal. But they said if you didn't do it, they'd come for you. And for everyone you love. The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. The fear in Maya's eyes was unmistakable. She knew they were in danger. And now Jamal knew too. He had no choice. He had to protect Maya. He had to protect his family. But at what cost? Are they coming here? Jamal asked, trying to steady his shaking voice. Maya nodded. I think so. I heard them say they'd be back tonight. Jamal felt the weight of the situation crash down on him. He couldn't let these people get to Maya. He couldn't let them win. He had to fight back, but how? How could he stop them when they seemed to know everything about him? A plan started to form in his mind. It wasn't perfect, but it was the only thing he could think of. He had to get help. He had to warn his family, warn the people who might have seen something, who might know more than he did. But first, he needed to get Maya to safety. I'm going to take you to Mrs. Johnson's house, Jamal said, his voice firm. She's the only one I trust right now. You're going to stay there until I figure this out. Maya looked hesitant, but she nodded, understanding the seriousness in his tone. She had seen the fear in his eyes and knew this was no time for second thoughts. Jamal quickly grabbed his jacket and led Maya out the back door. He didn't want to risk being seen by anyone watching from the front of the house. As they crept through the yard, Jamal kept his senses sharp, every noise around him making his heart race. He couldn't help but think about the man and the woman, the coldness in their eyes, the cryptic messages. What did they want? What was their endgame? And why had they singled him out? As they neared Mrs. Johnson's house, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, charged with danger. He glanced over at Maya, who was walking beside him, her small hand gripping his tightly. He had to keep her safe. He couldn't let her be taken, not after everything they had been through. Just as they approached the front door of Mrs. Johnson's house, a car slowly drove by, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Jamal froze, instinctively pulling Maya close to him. He watched the car pass, his heart hammering in his chest. It was them. They had found him. Jamal's mind raced. There was no time to waste. He had to act fast. Before he could make a move, the car screeched to a halt. The headlights blazed into his eyes, blinding him for a moment. Then, the car door opened, and the person who stepped out wasn't anyone he expected.